I thought I'd take this opportunity really quick to go over a couple of things, including just a basic explanation, kind of a slimmed down version of like what we should be doing each week. And then I wanted to take some time to review, as I promised in the email, the practice discussion that we had in week 1. There was a lot of good things, but I wanted to take this chance to kind of reinforce some of the strong points and kind of teach out some of the weaker parts of that discussion. So without further ado, let's get right into the basic format for the week. You're going to qualify as one of two people. You're going to either be scheduled as a discussion leader for the week. Remember, you'll be leading discussion in 2 of the 7 remaining weeks in the class. And in the weeks that you're not scheduled as a discussion leader, you will not be a discussion leader. But if you are scheduled as a discussion leader for this week or any subsequent week, the first thing you should be doing is looking at the chapters. This week in particular, we're going to be doing chapters 16 and 18. But then you also want to focus on the discussion leader assignments and get those in promptly. I'm still waiting for a couple of them for week 2 here. So the very first one is the identify document. Go to the engage section on primary source indexes. Basically, it's a bunch of tables of contents that I put together and scanned for you. You'll identify the document. Let me know which one you're looking at. I will scan it or send you a scanned version of the document, and I will post that document on Engage in the week that we're in. So this would be week 2. Again, you will see those as soon as I get them, and certainly, especially if everyone gets them in on time, by Tuesday morning, all of the documents for the week will be up. Once you identify a document as a discussion leader, your next task is to, in conjunction with your reading, to complete the 4-question assignment or the discussion leader assignment that is due on Thursday. Keep in mind, and I strongly encourage you, especially if this is your first discussion leader, to send me a draft of the 4-question assignment by Wednesday. The caveat to that, you can send it after Wednesday at 11:59 p.m., but there's no guarantee that I'm actually going to get to it in a timely fashion. But if you get it to me by Wednesday night at 11:55 p.m. is the deadline, I will get it to you before noon on Thursday, if not prior to that. And then the last thing you want to do as you're keeping track of the discussion on your document between Thursday and Sunday, you're going to want to create a sort of concluding response to the discussion on Sunday evening. Now, the rubrics and descriptions of all 3 of those assignments can be found in the Engage page in the Getting Started tab under the assignment sheets. Even if you are a discussion leader, you should always be focusing on your course project, just to keep that in mind. But certainly you'll have less time to focus on the course project when you are a discussion leader than if you are not. If you're not a discussion leader, so the 5 weeks that you're not actually leading discussion for that particular week, you're still expected to do the reading. Again, this week we're going to be reading chapters 16 and 18 in American Yawp. You will also be responsible for reading the primary source documents. These are the documents that your classmates have chosen and that they'll lead discussion on later in the week. Again, you will see those late on Monday or definitely by Tuesday morning, as long as they all get in on time. And you should start reading those with the goal of thinking about how you're going to respond to the discussion leader assignment that they post. In addition to doing this prep, you should always and also be focusing on your course project, specifically finding sources and completing assignments, keeping in mind that your first assignment, your second assignment, your abstract, is going to be due at the end of next week, week 3. So you want to make sure that you're working on this, especially ahead of time if you're scheduled to be a discussion leader in week 3. And then obviously from Friday through Sunday, concluding at 11:55 on Sunday evening, you will participate in the discussion forum. Keep in mind that your purpose in that discussion is to essentially replace one of your classmates' responses to one of the 4 questions on 3 separate discussion leader posts. One of the big issues in week 1 was that people had their posts, but they did not do the adequate number of responses to those posts. So we'll get all of that stuff in order. And keep in mind, if you have any questions at any time, you can certainly reach out and I will answer those questions promptly. But I did want to take a little bit of time to talk a little bit about practice discussion that we had last week. I wanted to, as I mentioned in the email, comment on that discussion as a whole and not kind of get into a whole bunch of different discussions. But keep in mind that I did give you individual feedback on your contribution. I emailed that to you because there was no place in the discussion to do that. And I thought that displaying your grade to other students in the class was not the right thing to do. So I did it this way. So certainly check that out, and all assignments that you get back from me with grades will have feedback, and you're certainly encouraged to check that out because it's only going to help you to increase your grade. So yes, we talked about the Declaration of Independence, a very familiar document. Keep in mind that moving forward, you're not going to be looking necessarily at familiar documents. So you'll want to keep in mind that you're trying to look at this objectively as someone who maybe hasn't seen this document before or heard about it before. So your purpose is to try to get as much information around the document as you possibly can. And so this document being a very familiar document, everyone's kind of got that background information and that came through in the responses fairly clearly. But in the actual discussion leader assignments, these are going to be much less familiar documents. And so you're going to have to do some legwork if you're going to actually get out all of the information that I'm requiring you to read into for these documents. So in terms of general comments, and then we'll talk about each one of the 4 questions individually, I want you to focus on answering each question deliberately. Each question is asking for something very, very different, and we'll see that as we go through each one of the questions individually. But I want you to focus on answering each question deliberately and directly. Try not to add a bunch of rhetorical flourish or big words or anything like that. You want to get straight to the point, be specific, clear, and concise as possible with each response. Within your answers, the way to sort of do this deliberate answering is to make claims. Don't just simply talk about the document. Make specific claims. This author was frustrated. That came up a lot. That was a good descriptor for how the author of the Declaration of Independence felt writing that document. So you want to make a claim like that. The author was frustrated, or this document was to establish the independence of the United States. You want to make those claims very, very clearly. You also want to base those claims on evidence, and you want to get that evidence from your textbook. The vast majority of these questions you should be able to answer with information in your textbook. If you can't find something in the textbook, specifically around authors, trying to identify authors, look somewhere else. Try Wikipedia, try Google, try something else. Or if you get stuck, please email me. Ask me for help. That is my job. I will help you. I also want you to focus on the limits of the source. A lot of people, especially with the Declaration of Independence, being that that is such a familiar document with most people, at least from the United States, I saw a lot of instances where you're linking the source, the Declaration of Independence, to the larger American Revolution. And certainly that's part of the larger event, but it is a singular source within that event. So I want you to avoid linking the source with other related events as if they are the same thing. And this is especially true when you're talking about significance. A lot of people mention that the Declaration of Independence showed the bravery and courage of the authors. I think by and large, you're referencing the revolution, the courage required in fighting a revolution. And that's not what was happening with the authors of the Declaration of Independence. Many of them did not fight. You also want to avoid generalizing and overstating the meaning, intent, or significance of the document. Stick to the functionality of the document. What is the purpose generally of this sort of document? And you want to make sure that you're kind of looking at the sort of immediate term in terms of significance, context, and other elements. So we're going to take a very quick look at the 4 questions individually and talk a little bit about what I'm looking for more specifically. For the first question, what happened? I want you to stick to the basics. A lot of the responses in this, to this question rather, really focused on things like context, how the author felt, or what the significance was. I want you to think very specifically about the basic narrative of what happened here. A bunch of guys representing the colonies got together in Philadelphia and wrote this document that declared its independence from Britain. It's a very simple way of sort of telling us who these people were and what they were doing there. What was the whole purpose of this document? You want to focus here on who was involved. You'll talk a little bit more about the who was involved in the second question, but you want to establish very clearly and very deliberately who the people were involved, not merely the authors, but the other involved parties. You want to identify the specific event. This was essentially a meeting of the Continental Congress. And so you want to think about it in terms of this specific event. This was a document that was written in the context of a legislative body. And you want to then also think about the function of the document in that context. So this was had a little bit of weight, certainly not as much weight as, say, a parliamentary rule or a royal proclamation from the king, but certainly as a sort of founding and foundational document, it did have some power. And think, by contrast, for example, what this letter would have meant, or what the significance of this letter would have been had it been written by some anonymous farmers from Western Pennsylvania. It would not have had nearly the function, because it didn't come from an official body like the Continental Congress. But of course, you want to think about the Continental Congress in the larger context of like the British Empire and Parliament and where it fit in there as well. But these are the kinds of questions, very, very basic, right to the point. What was going on around this case? Why was this document written again, the most basic sense? So, for example, if you're thinking about a letter, why would someone write a letter to another person? Or if you're reading a Supreme Court case decision, which you might read in this class, what is the purpose of a Supreme Court decision? Or a law? What is the purpose of a law? What is the purpose of a persuasive essay? Or what is the purpose of an informative essay? You want to think about these from the most basic functional perspective. The second question, you want to get a little bit more in depth, and the very first step in getting more in depth on what happened and why, you want to focus on the authors. And so indeed, this question is focusing in on the author or authors of this document. And here, you want to think very specifically about who those authors were. You want to think on one hand of the people who actually wrote the document, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and a couple others, John Jay, I believe it was. And then also think about those people who directly debated it and subsequently signed the document because they have some contributing influence as well. But you certainly want to think about the distinction between the influence that the authors, the writers of the document had, and those who were debating and signing it. But more than simply identifying the author, you want to think about who that person actually is. Sort of what title do they have, if any? What kind of power relationships do they have? What do they do for a living? Again, within that context, what do they bring to the table in terms of baggage? What sort of ideology, what sort of worldview do they bring? What sort of perspective do they bring to the table? You also want to think about who or what they represent, and this is done with specifically with an eye to who they do not represent. I saw a lot of people suggest that this sort of represented the colonists' view in general, and that's not necessarily true. You have to think about specifically, this is a group of representatives, but they represented a very specific portion of the colonial populace, the social and political elite of the colonies. And as events following the Declaration of Independence and the victory and the Revolution showed, there were a lot more conflicts than agreements among the colonists about what the meaning of the revolution was. And in fact, the people assembled at the Continental Congress had significant issues about the document, specifically comments on slavery that were eventually removed from the final document. So you want to think very, very critically about who or what the authors represent in the context of the document. And again, as I said before, one of the things that they bring to the table is their worldview, who influences them. Thomas Jefferson, very much influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers of the time and of the previous generations. So you want to kind of acknowledge that. A lot of people cited Jeremy Bentham and his role in influencing this document. You want to be a little bit more specific about what influence that thinker had. And in terms of proving or supporting your claims, for this question, you want to use the document itself for evidence. You don't necessarily need to directly quote the document, but you should certainly, beyond just simply who this author was, you want to tell me again, what were they thinking? What was their opinion about this specific issue? And you don't want to make assumptions about what they were thinking. You want to actually use the document as evidence for what this author was thinking. And here, a lot of people, and I was very happy about that, used words like frustration, fed up, annoyed, and then cited the list of grievances that they listed in the document itself. All of that is very, very significant for understanding what this document means, who these authors were, and what they thought about it. The third question is certainly the most in-depth section of this assignment, requiring the most effort. You want to get as much background information around the document as possible to establish why this thing happened, specifically in this specific place and this specific time. You want to think about the circumstances that led to this specific decision or the specific point of view, and then take an increasingly wide view of that motivation. So this is a group of people. They got together in Philadelphia as part of the Continental Congress. They wrote this document declaring their independence from England. Well, why did they decide to do that at that particular moment? What was going on before? What sort of abuses had occurred? And you can get that directly from the document. What abuses had occurred that led these colonists to decide that instead of wanting to be a more integral part of the British Empire, they sought to specifically separate from the British Empire. And beyond simply, again, identifying the place and time, you want to be very specific and very critical about why this happened in this place and at this specific time. Why did this meeting not happen in a farming community in Boston, or a plantation context in the South? Why did this happen in Philadelphia? Maybe not specifically Philadelphia, but a large eastern coastal city. Like, why is that significant? Why is it significant that the Continental Congress was formed? Why is it significant that this is the step that they chose to take in July of 1776, based on other decisions that they had made prior to this? What were the efforts to either reconcile or critique or deal with the British Empire in the previous time frame? Here, you don't necessarily need to use the document for evidence of this, although in this specific case, there's plenty of evidence that would give you some sense of why this happened at this particular time. But here, you're going to use a lot of the textbook for evidence. And of course, in the practice, you didn't have, although a couple people did actually cite the textbook, which was good, but I didn't actually require you to read the chapter. The chapter would give you, and will give you, a lot more background information to explain why a specific event took place, and you're going to want to be very, very careful as you're doing the reading as a discussion leader to identify as many bits of context as possible, because that's only going to add to our understanding of why this event took place. And then finally, what do we think about this? And this is kind of an interesting question, because though it sounds like an opinion question, it's not an opinion question. This is a question that I want you to answer not as a person who's living in 2019 with your own views. I want you to answer this question in the context of being an amateur historian. So I want you to think more specifically about the impact of this document on the immediate term and not on the longer term. Yes, the Declaration of Independence has very important significance in popular understandings of American history, but I want you to be a lot more specific and recognize that the Declaration of Independence at the time actually eliminated the possibility once and for all of reconciliation between the United States and the British Empire, and really set up, although hostilities had occurred prior to the signing of the document, it pretty much assured that a violent conflict was going to happen after this. And it also, if you want to think a little bit wider on this, had a significant influence on other revolutions that followed similar patterns after this, like the French Revolution or the Haitian Revolution. So these are the kinds of sort of what do we think about this questions that we're actually looking to answer here. And again, as with the very first question, I want you to think more about the functionality of the document, the influence of the author, and the effectiveness of the message than any sort of larger symbolic or present-day significance. Certainly, once we get to the last couple of chapters, you'll be looking at the significance to the present day. But understand that despite the fact that something did happen in this case in 1776, a lot of other things have happened between 1776 and today that have had much more immediate and much more direct impact on how things are today than this particular document. Okay, so that's about it. I want to come back real soon, hopefully by tonight, perhaps not till tomorrow, a very brief introduction to chapter 16 and 18, talking about kind of the Gilded Age in the United States as a sort of overarching conceptual topic. So stay tuned.